Welcome, everyone. Really pleased to be moderating this event today. And we want to thank you for joining. This is a Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar. It's about investigating the U.S. election by digging into anti-democratic efforts to sideline voters. My name is Gauri Ramachandran. I'm a Director of Elections and Security at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law. And today we're going to be discussing threats to certification and voter eligibility in the U.S. elections. It's an alarming challenge ahead of our next election in just about a month in early November. So as we're preparing for this really high stakes presidential election, there have been some critical threats that we're going to discuss today to the integrity of election certification and to voter eligibility. So across some of the key states, there are election officials who have been supporting false and discredited claims of widespread voter fraud, and then using those claims and using their positions to really undermine confidence in the election, which of course is threatening the foundation of the democratic process. At the same time, the vast majority of election officials really do their jobs in a nonpartisan manner and are just trying to ensure that every eligible voter can participate in the process. They're also trying to educate the public with accurate information about how to do so. And just for doing those jobs, they've been subject to threats, intimidation, and other abuse. As have other participants in the democratic process, like candidates, journalists, and volunteers. So all of you investigative journalists really play a critical role in uncovering these influences and ensuring transparency in the electoral process. So in the webinar, we have three amazing experts to speak with you today, and they're going to explore how journalists can investigate and report on efforts to undermine certification and otherwise interfere with voters' access. So they'll provide tools to understand the legal rules, the political forces at play, and just really provide some amazing insights that we're lucky to have on election law, the role of election disinformation, and how to effectively report on these issues this year in 2024. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Justin Glau. He's an independent journalist, and he is the author of a forthcoming book, If I Am Coming to Your Town, Something Terrible Has Happened. And he writes the newsletter American Doom. He is the author of a major Rolling Stone investigation into local election officials who have been aligned with false claims about the 2020 election made by former President Donald Trump. His work focuses on political extremism and its impact on democracy, and he's going to really help us shed light on officials who might use their roles to challenge or refuse to certify legitimate election results. Our second speaker is going to be Carrie Levine. She is the managing editor at VoteBeat. She was previously a senior reporter for the Center for Public Integrity. When she was there, she covered voting access as well as money in politics and influence. And before that, she was the research director at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, which is a nonpartisan watchdog group. And then finally, we're going to have Nikhil Sus. He is Deputy Chief Counsel at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. He specializes in litigation there and advocacy to promote accountability, transparency, and ethics in government. And he contributed to a really valuable report that Crew put out called Election Certification Under Threat, which they released in August 2024. And that's really a legal roadmap for how to protect the upcoming election. So before we start, I'm going to do just a little bit of housekeeping. So first, just some information for you about Global Investigative Journalism Network. It is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations. There are 244 member organizations across 90 countries, but it works with journalists everywhere in nonprofits, with freelancers, and with commercial organizations. And there's a whole range of resources for you and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide. That is available at gijn.org. I also want to note that we're really excited to get questions from those of you in the audience. So please send those in the Q&A box on your Zoom there. and we'll get to as many as we can. You can start asking questions even, while the speakers are speaking. They'll be saved in that Q&A box. And then when the speakers are finished, Emily O'Sullivan from GIGN is going to come on screen with us and help us moderate those questions that you've submitted through that Q&A function. And then finally, I did want to know that this session is being recorded, just so people know that that's occurring, and it will be posted later on YouTube. So with that, I know that was a long introduction, but hopefully I've gotten you all really excited about the expertise you're going to get today. With that, I think we'll turn it over to Justin to begin and tell us about your research, and hopefully we'll come away not feeling too much doom, but perhaps some. Oh, I believe you're muted, Justin.
Yeah, hopefully not feeling too doomed after all of this. But thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to run through kind of three things here, just so you guys know ahead of when I start rambling, I guess. But I'm going to hit what I found in my investigation, what stories I think remain, and talk a little bit about the methodology for my report. So for those not familiar, back in I guess it was July, I published a story at Rolling Stone that uncovered nearly 70 election deniers who work as local election officials in swing states. I think this number is probably low because I would call my research methodology on this pretty cursory, which I'll explain more a bit in a second. The background is I started on this project in the immediate aftermath of 2020 and ramped up my efforts after the 2022 midterms. And that's because I saw a narrative emerge in the national political press that election denialism had sort of lost at the ballot. Several election deniers who had run for statewide and federal offices like secretaries of state and congressional positions had lost to Democrats and more moderate Republicans. So that's where that narrative came from. At this point, I had already done enough research to know that election deniers were in local positions of power in some counties in Georgia. And at the time, this wasn't really being reported at all. So the contrast between my growing understanding of election deniers working as election officials in Georgia and this narrative of election denialism sort of losing at the ballot kind of became stark. So what I did was I set out to try to compile something that what I quickly learned was going to be very difficult to achieve, which was the total number of election deniers working in election administration. This turned out to be a very difficult task. So in order of importance for what I found in that research that led to that Rolling Stone story in July, at least 19 states have some level of local election administration. This means that cities, counties, townships, or other forms of municipalities have an office, board, or official who oversees the local administration of elections. They set up polling locations, they staff them, they adjudicate ballots where it's unclear what the voter's intent was, they hear challenges to eligible voters. And in the other states that don't have local election administration, this is up to secretaries of state. And Nicole and Carrie, I'm sure, can correct me if I'm wrong about any of that, but that's at least my understanding of how this works. So in those states, there are thousands of officials, both appointed and elected, who oversee elections. So this was the universe of potential bad actors that I had to work with. In a lot of these places, these folks weren't listed online. And I'll explain some of the methodology about figuring out who they were. So for this subset of election officials, local election officials, what I found was perhaps not surprising. At least it certainly isn't in hindsight. But many of these people are not what I would call sophisticated bureaucrats. They're for lack of a better term, they're regular people. They're retired and serving in these roles in their spare time. And as such, they have a somewhat unsophisticated understanding of election systems, let alone things like federal and state law. Uh, Many of them are older, white, and in many places conservative leaning. And in my mind, this makes them perhaps more susceptible to misinformation about elections. Um, and for many of them, that misinformation comes primarily from their Facebook feeds. Many of these officials appear to use Facebook as their primary source of communication and maybe even their information source. So their pages, some of their pages were just awash with conspiracies and misinformation, not just about elections, but about all sorts of right-wing content. As far as what stories are still out there, I think there's a lot to be done. And at the top of the list is congressional certification of election, which I'm hoping that I can hear from Carrie and Nickel on in a little bit, because I think that is the big story that's still out there. I think that I never got to complete that full list of election denial officials working in election administration. And so I think having that, and there's a lot of resources that will include from different places, databases that have a lot of these denier people, but the big database has still yet to be constructed. And I think that getting to that would really help the public understand how widespread this belief system is, and perhaps provide opportunities to hold these folks accountable. So that is one potential story that's still out there. The another potential story is tying all of this behavior and these beliefs and these local officials sort of up the chain of command within the American right and within Republican power structures, right? I've come to think of this movement, this election denial movement, as sort of a decentralized network of actors all working towards the same goals, but not necessarily coordinating in a highly organized way. But there is evidence that some of the actions taken by these local officials are in coordination with those larger groups. In this case, in the cases that I'm thinking of, that hierarchy includes organizations like state Republican parties, local Republican parties in counties, the Republican National Committee, the America First Policy Institute, and perhaps even the Trump campaign himself. So tying those actions like refusing to certify results, which I think we'll hear more about later, hearing mass voter challenges, instituting hand counts and paper ballots to higher power structures within the Republican Party and the conservative movement is a big story that I've begun to think of as sort of the next election interference case. Because I think when you start tying all of this stuff together, what we're going to find is an ongoing election interference or subversion case. I want to get moving here because I know I'm about 15 minutes. Just real quick, the methodology of my research for this story, it combined using databases like the Insurrection Index, States United's replacing the REF, Insurrection Exposed from Center for Media and Democracy, but also because these are small offices, I ended up having to just call a lot of these places and say, who's on your election board, right? And then once I did that, then I basically just did simple Google searches to see if they had come up in local news stories about what they had been doing as members of the election board. And then I went and I found their social media. I found them on Facebook. And that's where things really opened up, because it didn't take very long before I was finding people who were serving as local election officials who were posting all sorts of crazy stuff. And so never discount the power and the draw of people to want really to have credit for their beliefs and for, being a part of this movement and posting stuff online that perhaps you and I might think of as kind of crazy. But for a lot of these folks, it's good for them to do this. And they also see no problem with it. So, anyway, I'll end there and leave it up to the other folks on this panel to describe what their view of this is.
Thank you so much, Justin. I did want to ask one question, which maybe you might want to answer, and then when Carrie and Kel speak, they might speak to as well. When you spoke to some of these folks, I was so curious, did people deny that they were, engaged in an effort to undermine elections? Did they say, no, I'm the one who's actually trying to make sure things are fair? I'm just curious if you spoke to any of the people you identified and how that interaction went.
Yes, I did speak to several of these folks, and for the most part, it's like they are true believers, and their term for all of this is election integrity, right? Well, what's wrong with election integrity? What's wrong that I posted about conspiracies about elections? I'm working for election integrity. So like that's the irony of all of some of this, is that like what you and I and what experts and lawyers and bipartisan election officials consider to be inappropriate behavior and unfounded beliefs, these people, they want credit for that because they're in a different belief system than the many other people. So the irony is that like the bad things that they're doing, they're going to post about them and brag about them in a way.
Thank you. And I think we're going to go to Carrie next.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us for this today. And thanks, Justin, for that. It was really interesting. And I think it's good for people to get a window into how some of this works. So I'm the managing editor of VoteBeat. I cover voting access and elections in several states. And if you haven't checked us out, we're at votebeat.org. We've written about certification and other issues, and some of that might be helpful to journalists getting their arms around this issue. So I wanted to start by kind of backing out a little bit, because I think people like the three of us, or the four of us, Gary, I'm including you in this, spend a lot of time deep in the weeds on these issues and forget how confusing they can be to people who don't spend all of their time sitting there trying to read, the election code in Michigan, right? And so I wanted to back out a little bit and say we're really talking a lot about certification, which until 2020 was an incredibly routine, arcane step in finalizing election results that people basically paid no attention to most of the time. I mean, yes, there are some examples in history where this has flared up. It's kind of interesting to look back at that, but one of the things I will say is that most of the time this happened in very lightly attended public meetings and, obscure conference rooms, and was considered a very routine processy kind of step. And in 2020, that changed because this came up in Michigan, right? When boards of canvassers who were supposed to take that final step started getting lobbied by former President Donald Trump and allies of former President Donald Trump not to certify the election. And suddenly everyone had to start paying attention to certification. So what certification is at the local level is the finalization of election results. On election night, you're going to see results coming in around the country, and the timing of that's going to vary depending on when polls close and depending on a variety of processes in place for announcing election results, for processing ballots, for processing absentee ballots. Those results will be coming out through the night, but they are unofficial results. After the election, there's still a lot of work for election officials to do to finalize results. There's still absentee ballots in some states that can arrive up to a couple of days after the election, right? And that those deadlines vary by state, but those, if they arrive by the deadline or postmarked by the deadline, depending on how your state does it, have to be counted and added to the tally. People at the polls sometimes cast for different reasons what's called provisional ballots, which means they will be counted if certain conditions are met. And so boards of elections in various places will meet, will look at those provisional ballots, will decide if they should be counted and added to the tally. Sometimes military and overseas ballots are still coming in. this is the period of time that election officials use to check the unofficial results, to make sure everything has been done correctly, to conduct, in some cases, audits, right? Different things are going on. And so they are finalizing those results. And there is a time period in the law in every state that they have to do that. And there's deadlines in every state when that has to be done at the local level. So these boards of elections will be meeting with elections directors, and they'll be working through all this. And then there's a time when they look at all of this, when they look at the tallies and they say, okay, these tallies are a complete and accurate reflection of the votes cast in this election. We're certifying our local results, and typically like that's going on to the state, right? And then the state has a process and deadlines to get all of these results from their local jurisdictions. And in most states, that's counties, but in some states, that's towns or townships, right? Like depending on whether you're in Maine or you're in Arizona, this process works somewhat differently, but it's all set out in the law, right? This is not something people are inventing as they go along. There's legal deadlines, there's processes, there's guidance that's issued by state election officials. So all of these results by the set deadline are supposed to go to the state, which certifies its results. And then there's sort of what's known as the state harbor deadline of December 11th. And I've given some resources to GIJN that should get passed on to you that have the kind of information you can look up by state, that have the kind of federal deadlines. But by December 11th, the executive of every state is supposed to issue what's called a certificate of ascertainment. That appoints the people who are known as electors, right? These are the people who are going to cast the state's electoral votes. And those certificates are sent up to Congress so that Congress can finalize the election. And that happens by December 11th. So all of those state and local deadlines are backing out from that. And I'm sure people are going to correct me if I describe this imprecisely or incorrectly. But basically, this is a whole process that's taking place in thousands of jurisdictions around the country. And it's a parallel process, right? Like people are working through it for their county, for their state. And so, depending on where you are, one option that I would suggest for all the reporters covering this is learn how this works, right? Get some sense of how this works where you are, get some sense of who's involved in it, get some sense of what people have to do. Now, after 2020, right, after what happened at the state level in places like Michigan and at the federal level, when Congress met to certify the election with the breach of the US Capitol, everyone said, all right, well, we got to take a look at this process. We've got to figure out what the vulnerabilities are in this process, and we have to shore it up. And so Congress passed what was known as the Electoral Count Act reform, which changed the thresholds of the numbers of members of Congress that can object to certifying a state's electoral votes, which made some changes to the process. And states passed changes too. For example, in Michigan, they wanted to really clarify that certifying, and this is true basically in every state, is what's known as a ministerial duty, right? Members of these boards of canvassers, they have to do it. And if they don't, there's now penalties in the law, right? It's now written into the state's constitution that they have to do it. And so many states have made changes. Michigan is, I think, among the most significant, but many states have made changes to make it clear that this has to be done. So since the 2020 election, after the 2022 election, in some cases in primaries, we've had local officials who haven't wanted to certify, who have said they will not certify. For instance, in Cochise County, Arizona, this happened. And what has happened in every instance so far is they have, in the end, certified the election. So I don't mean to be the panel optimist. I'm not, inherently an optimist, right? Like we all know human nature is dark and people are doing things, and I'm not trying to put a pretty face on it. But one of the things I want to note is that people have taken this very seriously. And so when local officials in states like New Mexico and Arizona and Pennsylvania have declined to certify, state officials have gone to court and gotten, a mandamus order, which basically means the court is telling the local officials, sorry, you've got to do it. And in every case, they have then backed off and done so. Sometimes they have been reluctant. Sometimes there have been public meetings where many people have gotten up and angrily told them they should not. But in every case, ultimately, the election has been certified. And so I think we just had a wave of concern about this because in Georgia, the state elections board passed new rules saying local officials can conduct a reasonable inquiry into results before certifying. And that very properly raised concerns that this was an effort to allow delay so that the state would miss the certification deadlines or localities would miss the certification deadlines. It gave local officials who wanted to promote doubts about the integrity of elections a vehicle to do that within certification, right? But there's actually a lawsuit going on about that role and whether the Georgia State Elections Board had the right to pass it. State elections officials from both parties have criticized it, and there seems to be a consensus that the court is very likely to rule that that is not proper. We'll see what the court actually rules, but at the end of the day, the state law in Georgia says that elections have to be certified. And some people say, okay, well, if there's a question about the election, if people have concerns about election fraud, isn't that a reason not to certify? And the answer in the law in almost every state is no. If you have questions about what happened in the election, if you think that there has been fraud, if you think there has been something improper, there are separate remedies built into the law to address that. And often people can't go to court and assert something has been done incorrectly or go to court and assert there's a problem with election fraud in the election until the election has been certified. In some states, that then starts the period in which you can then have your concerns heard in court. So certification is something that is supposed to happen and then in every case has happened. And I think what you'll see is that most of the swing states where people are concerned about this are now run by elections who have been through fights over certification with local officials, who have had to take local officials to court and deal with this and are very, very aware they may have to do that again in 2024. So I think it's important to keep in mind that context when talking about covering certification. Do I think we're going to see some local officials attempt to not certify the election? I think it's entirely likely. But I also think that every single state election official seems aware of that possibility and prepared to go to court over it, especially in the swing states that are expected to be hotly contested. And so far, the courts have ruled that this must be done. So I also think it's important when writing about this to have that context so that people know that that has been what's happened in these instances, because I think the public has a lot to be alarmed about with this election. And I think it's important to also talk about the remedies, right? So I'm going to pass this on because I think I'm at about 10 minutes. But I have also written about this. I think it's important to watchdog the local officials, right? It's important to make sure to cover clearly and significantly any attempt to delay or put off certification because it's a really important step. But I also think it's important to be aware of how this works in your state and what the remedies are and to know that going into this election. And I'd recommend everyone familiarize themselves with that.
Thank you, Carrie. I did have one question, which really I think any of you could jump in on before Nikhil gets started with his formal, more formal presentation or informal, whatever we want to call it, which is when you talk about watchdogging the local officials, I've been seeing as I've been tracking this, you mentioned that these certification meetings or processes used to be very lightly attended, but now, like, you sometimes get, angry, large attendances of people. Have you seen in your reporting, or Justin or Nikhil in your research, do you think that there's some intimidation factor going into this, sort of people being intimidated into these delays and this sort of thing?
I don't think that anyone is refusing to certify elections because they have been intimidated into it exactly. I think if people are declining to vote to certify in the first instance, they are somewhat inclined that way. Justin spoke so well about finding comments by people involved in the election process, involved in the certification process, who have doubts about elections, who have voiced conspiracy theories about elections, who have said things about elections. And we in our reporting have also found that last year in the off-year elections, our Pennsylvania reporter found, commissioner candidates in Pennsylvania, local officials in Pennsylvania who had said things like that, put together a Pennsylvania specific database of that. And so I absolutely think that's out there. But I also think local officials see themselves as being responsive to their constituents, right? And so when you have a room full of angry people yelling at you not to certify, and maybe you have your own views on this, your own questions that you've already voiced, you're already receptive to it, you're more inclined to listen to it. But yeah, I think we're seeing overflow crowds at some of these meetings. I think we're seeing angry people. I think we're seeing a need for more security at local meetings. And as much as I like to encourage people to engage with their democracy, that's not great, right? Like showing up and threatening local officials is not actually what I have ever meant by that. Um, so I think it's a tough environment for people. I think we have also seen some people be extraordinarily brave, right? Like what happened in Michigan ultimately was there were Republicans who bucked their party, who bucked those people imploring them not to certify and said, no, my duty is to certify. So I think we've seen both the best and the worst through this process. Um, and it's not easy to give a clear answer.
There
Yeah, thank
was
you. Oh, go ahead, Justin. Sorry.
it's like there was one instance where it looked like the intimidation worked that I remember, and that was in Washoe County, Nevada, back in June. And there was a woman there who went back on a previous decision to certify the results of her own election, by the way, where she had won. And after hours and hours and hours of hearing from people say, oh, there was all this fraud, and come up with these unfounded claims of possible fraud that occurred. She ended up reversing the vote and voted with two of her Republican colleagues to not certify the results of her own election. Now, after that, the county attorney, I mean, during that, the county attorney was telling them, hey, you can't do this. After that, I think the Secretary of State or the AG or somebody said, hey, look, you got to certify. And then they ended up certifying. But that was a surprise, right? Like we thought that she was going to vote to certify, and she reversed her decision on that after hearing from election denial activists for hours and hours at a public meeting. And I think that that is going to happen in November when it comes time for local election bodies and officials to certify results. These meetings are going to be packed, and they're going to be packed with people pressuring them to start investigations and not certify and do all of these things that are outside of their authority as county election boards in Georgia, at least. And yeah, it's kind of going to be a mess, I think.
And I'll note the pressure goes both ways, right? Like, and I think we should turn this over to Nikhil, but I'll just note too that everyone is aware of this. So there were multiple votes in Mojave County in Arizona, which is a pretty, right-leaning county, over hand counting ballots. And over again, people they showed up, they were angry, people tried to get them to hand count the ballots, and state officials sent a letter basically saying, this is against the law. And the county attorney said, if you do this against my advice, you're going to be personally liable for it. And they didn't do it. And that's happening with certification too. We just had a case in Michigan where Kalamazoo member of the canvassing board was sort of saying he wouldn't certify, like, well, I don't know, I'm going to see what the election is. The ACLU immediately sued him, took him to court, and said, it's very clear in Michigan you have to do this. We're looking for the court to tell you ahead of time, ahead of the 2024 election, that you've got no discretion here. And the guy immediately settled the lawsuit and said he would certify. I mean, it didn't even make it into the courtroom. Like he immediately said, oh, well, I was taken out of context. I didn't mean it. I'm absolutely going to certify the election. Here's a declaration. Please drop this lawsuit. So I think there's absolutely pressure at these public meetings not to do it. There's also a lot of pressure and a lot of awareness pushing people to do it. How that's going to come out, I don't know. Like I said, I agree with Justin. I think that there are going to be instances where people try not to do it, but I think that there is also just a lot of mechanisms in place right now. Everyone is very aware of the need to make sure people do this.
Thank you, Carrie. And we'll turn it over to Nikhil. And I think you and Justin have both been raising, I think really highlights the importance of reporting on the non-noisy, just regular people who who want the accurate results to be certified and things to be done on time. Because you're right, I think it can be hard for people when they're faced with, an angry room that may not really represent the local population. But Nikhil, let's turn it over to you.
Great. And I'm happy to just jump in here with a few thoughts on the last comment, just to echo my co-panelists' really great observations. I would also add that the state Republican parties in some of these states have explicitly urged county officials who are in some cases appointed by the party to not certify. And so this is adding to the narrative and, fueling the narrative and fueling the threats of intimidation and potential violence against county officials, and sort of spreading this narrative that the certification process is discretionary and that they have some discretion over this process, does in and of itself fuel potential violence. And we saw that on January 6th when the former president spread the lie that Vice President Pence had discretion to overturn the 2020 election, when he did not. And so I just want to sort of, at the risk of belaboring the point, I just wanted to add to it. But my name is Nikhil Suss. I'm a deputy chief counsel at CREW. As folks have mentioned earlier, CREW has put out a report earlier this year that focuses specifically on the threats to county level certification. And just for some context here, since 2020, more than 30 rogue county officials across the country have voted to deny or delay certifying election results in violation of law. Often they have cited, as folks have pointed out, false claims of voter fraud or irregularities. Among these folks are avowed 2020 election deniers, individuals who acted as fake electors for Donald Trump, and a criminally convicted participant in the January 6th insurrection, who was later removed from office in a lawsuit filed by CREW. To be clear, refusing to count and certify lawful votes is voter disenfranchisement, period, and it is illegal. Certification is a purely administrative, non-discretionary act. As I mentioned earlier, just as Mike Pence had no discretion on January 6th to overturn the election, county officials have no discretion to refuse to certify. State laws provide robust procedures outside of the certification process for detecting and resolving alleged fraud and irregularities, including through the courts. But that is not the point of certification, and that is not the job of county election boards. Certification is merely confirmation of accurate tabulations of votes cast. It's just one step in a multi-step process with numerous checks and safeguards to ensure election integrity. By withholding certification, county officials could be obstructing the proper legal processes for challenging election results in court. They could be preventing state officials from fulfilling their own duties under state law, and they could cause the state to miss state or federal certification deadlines. Now, fortunately, there are ample legal safeguards that exist to protect against such outcomes. As a nonpartisan government watchdog group, CREW believes it's critical that the public is both made aware of the threats and reassured that the law provides effective mechanisms to shut them down. Now, in terms of our report on the scope and methodology of it, we identified 35 county officials across the country who have refused to certify results and may be in a position to do so again this year. So we didn't focus on folks who have been removed from office or resigned from office. We detail elections in which these officials refused to certify and documented their stated reasons for doing so, citing primary government sources where available. And we also focused on the 8 states where this has happened since 2020, and that is Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. The report also identifies the legal remedies that are available to state and federal authorities, as well as voters, to compel compliance with the law, to punish misconduct, and to remove obstructionist officials from their county positions. Our report includes a number of recommendations. The first is, before any election, state authorities should explicitly advise county officials of their non-discretionary certification duties and the civil and criminal penalties that they could face for noncompliance, as Michigan authorities did earlier this year. Second, state authorities should bring expedited mandamus litigation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, to swiftly resolve certification disputes in the state's highest court, where that is an option. Third, states should utilize mechanisms where available for state election officials to step in to certify election in place of obstructionist county officials, as Colorado and other state law allows. Fourth, states should utilize mechanisms where available for state election boards or court to remove obstructionist county officials who willfully disregard their legal duties. And finally, if county officials willfully violate the law, state authorities should pursue appropriate civil and criminal remedies. And if state authorities fail to act, then the federal authorities should pursue appropriate civil and criminal remedies to protect federal voting rights. So just to sort of give folks some context here, I'm going to walk through the report itself, and I'm going to try to share the screen. See if this works. All right. So this report, it's available on our website, and I believe it's been linked in the chat. Here is an overview of what we're covering. We have both a state-by-state breakdown here. We have the federal legal remedies compiled here, and then we have an appendix with a number of court filings from these certification refusal cases, where you can see how either state authorities or voters responded in court, and how they were successfully able to obtain court orders or other forms of relief to compel certification. I think it would be helpful to just walk through one state. So we'll start with Arizona. So the way the report is laid out is that for each state, we explore the election certification framework at the county level. Now, there are other aspects to the certification process under both state and federal law that we do not cover in this report, but there are many resources out there by groups such as Brennan, Protect Democracy, Campaign Legal Center, and other groups that have explored sort of the full scope of the certification process from county to federal, but this report is focused on county level certification. So we first identify the general framework, how certification works in the state, who's involved in the process, and at what point the county level authority is supposed to certify and transmit the election returns to the state authority. Next, we catalog each county official that we identified in the 8 states where certification refusals have happened since 2020, who have voted to refuse or delay certification. We identify them by name, we identify their position, the specific election that they refuse to certify, and the stated reasons that they refuse to certify. And there are a number of links in here. What we've linked to where possible are official government records, typically videos of the board meetings where they made the statements for why they were refusing to certify, or explanations for why they're refusing to certify, or meeting minutes or other agendas, things like that that the county has on their website. We also compiled any statements that we were able to mine from social media. As you'll see here, this official in Arizona made a number of concerning statements on Facebook that we have screen grabbed and linked here, sort of explaining her reasoning for refusing to certify, including explicitly admitting she was doing it as a political message and that she was protesting the election practices in a different county that she is not an official in, which is clearly improper. And then what we have after the list of officials are the various legal remedies that state authorities and voters could pursue. And the first remedy here is mandamus. Mandamus is a Latin word for an emergency court order to compel a government official to comply with the law. So if the law says government officials shall do X, you can go to court to pursue a writ of mandamus to compel that government official to perform that act, whatever the law says. And the good news is that in every state that we have explored, and every state in the country has a mandamus remedy. And so if a county official, and it makes certification a mandatory act. So if a county official does try to obstruct or delay certification, this is a remedy that is available in every state, and including every state that's covered in this report in the battleground states. And it is because the issue is a fairly straightforward legal question. It often the case can be filed directly in the state Supreme Court, which is ideal because that sort of expedites the proceedings and avoids the need to go to a trial court and a intermediate appellate court before going to the state's highest court. And because these cases arise under state law, it is our expectation that they would not, there would be no grounds to take the case up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, in all likelihood, in mandamus litigation of this type, the state's highest court would have the final say on the pertinent legal questions. Another relevant legal consideration in every state is the constitutional right to vote. The U.S. Constitution doesn't explicitly create a constitutional right to vote, but every state covered in our report does have one of those clauses in their state constitution. And that is important both to obtain legal relief and is also an important consideration in any mandamus litigation because, as I noted earlier, refusing to count and certify votes is disenfranchising voters, plain and simple. And if a state authority or a county authority is refusing to count votes, then they are violating the right to vote and the right to have one's vote counted. So the constitutional right to vote is pretty critical in any state where this arises. So next we walk through what happens if a board of supervisors or a county election board refuses a court order to certify. In other words, a court issues a mandamus, but somebody on the county board says, I'm not going to follow the court order. I don't care what the court says. Well, there are a number of remedies to address that situation. The first is the court can actually appoint a substitute official to carry out the job, to do the job. This remedy is typically used in issues, disputes over property, real property, but it does apply to any case where a court orders an official to do something and the party is disobedient, and there is a viable third party that could be appointed to fulfill that duty, which would apply in this circumstance. There are also civil and criminal contempt consequences that a county official or county board would potentially face if they refuse to comply with their mandatory certification obligations. There are also a number of criminal provisions in each state that would directly apply to a county official who willfully refuses to certify an election. And the law in each state varies, but at a high level, sort of the common thread here is it is a crime to willfully interfere with another state official's ability to do their job. And so if a county official refuses to certify and that interferes with, say, the Secretary of State's ability to perform the statewide canvass of votes and certification at the state level, that could be a state crime. And there could be significant penalties for committing that conduct. And you actually saw this in Arizona. The Arizona Attorney General has charged two county officials for interfering by refusing to comply with their canvassing and certification duties, interfering with the duties of the Secretary of State, and that case remains ongoing. Thus far, Arizona is the only state that has actually brought criminal charges against one of these county level certification refusers. Other criminal statutes could relate to willful refusal to perform an official duty. And so tying this back to the mandamus point, if there's clear evidence that a county official not only refused to perform a legal duty that the state law requires them to do, but also that they disregarded warnings from state officials like the attorney general, a local prosecutor, or the secretary of state, that this is something they have to do, and they have no discretion over it. If they ignore those warnings, then they're risking criminal liability under various state laws. There are also remedies relating to conspiracy, criminal contempt that are sort of related to these other crimes that I discussed. So that is I'm going to stop sharing now. So that is sort of an overview of the report, how it could potentially be used in a helpful way by journalists, both to give you sort of a framework for the election certification process at the county level in the 8 states that are covered in the report, and also in giving you sort of a more of a bird's eye view of the common legal issues in each state and the common sort of reasons that some of these county level officials have given for refusing to certify. Finally, I just wanted to close with some considerations for journalists specifically. In addition to our litigation and advocacy work, Crew has submitted another records request to county election offices around the country to try to obtain information reflecting any sort of coordination between county officials, and partisan political campaigns, or known election denialist groups. And we have, made what we've obtained, what records we've obtained available to journalists, including Justin, who has done some excellent reporting in The Guardian and Rolling Stone on some of the findings that we've made public. And, on the sort of public records point, it's important to draft like targeted requests here. And I think there's a lot of potential to draft targeted requests here. One way to do it is to simply ask for all communications between a particular county official and all the email domains that are associated with these election denialist groups. We've obtained a lot of really valuable, insightful records by submitting requests like that. We haven't limited the subject matter because it's more important like who they are talking to than what they are saying. And if you focus on who they are talking to, you will probably get the interesting stuff. And so that is what we have been doing and continue to pursue, both at the county level and at the state level. Um, in terms of interfacing with government officials as journalists, one thing that's incredibly important is getting election denying government officials at the federal, state, or county level on record on whether they will certify. And you are seeing a concerted push right now in that respect. Carrie pointed out the successful ACLU lawsuit. I think that is a great example. I should say lawsuit and settlement, because they settled the case after they sued the county canvasser who said he would refuse to certify. He got scared and backed down and signed an affidavit that said he would, in fact, certify the election as required by law. And I think that's a great example of using the law like preemptively before the election to try to resolve these questions beforehand, because we don't want this to happen after the fact. And so that case was based on statements to the press. And if a reporter had not asked that county canvasser if he was going to refuse to certify, that it would not have been possible to bring that case. And so it is not only important to get this information out there for these purposes, but the public should know, and the folks in their county should know whether the people responsible for certifying the election in their county are actually going to follow the law. And lastly, it's also important from our perspective, at least, to get these state law enforcement and election officials on record on how they will respond to certification refusals. Some states have been really clear, and again, Carrie brought up the Michigan example. I think that is a great example because the state authorities there have been incredibly proactive in sending out warning letters and putting officials on notice of what their legal duties are, and that has a real deterrent effect. It works, but not all states have done that. We would like to see more of that, and so it's important for the press, to the extent that they can and are in a position to do so, to sort of get a clear understanding from state authorities about how they are preparing to address this threat, because there are legal safeguards here that are available to both state authorities and voters. But I want to be clear, like, this should not be normalized. It is not normal that you have to go to court and get an emergency court order to get a county official to do their job. This is incredibly abnormal and not something that has historically had to happen. And so I am cautiously optimistic, like Harry, that these efforts are going to fail, but this is not something that should have to happen at all. And so we should all be on notice and prepared for what's ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I see Carrie has her hand up, and of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts, Carrie. And I'm interested in really hearing from any of you about, so if there are some of these shenanigans in the post-election period, how can a journalist tell the difference between um, there's just a discrepancy of one voter, like one voter checked in to a polling place and then had to run out because their kid had an emergency and didn't vote. And this is like no big deal, and people should be certifying the election anyway, versus, hey, there's like 100 ballots missing. Somebody has misplaced a box, or somebody has misplaced a thumb drive. We need to sort this out, and make sure we've got the accurate number before we certify. What would be your advice on how to how to sort through the difference between those things?
I just wanted to add, in response to your question, I think everyone on this panel has made the same point, which is that reporting and accountability is really important here, right? If someone's saying there's questions about the election to the point where they don't want to certify, they had better explain in response to your questions exactly what the problem is, because minor discrepancies happen. We're talking about millions of ballots across, again, tens of thousands of jurisdictions being counted by untold numbers of people. There are going to be minor discrepancies for reasons like the one that you just mentioned. Someone gets a ballot and then runs out, forgets to spoil it. Things are going to happen, but anyone saying there's a problem had better be prepared to explain exactly what the problem is. right? Specificity and precision is your friend here, because what you'll find is that they can't. And the thing that I wanted to add is that it is also true, and I should have said this, that in some states, there are still ongoing court cases in addition to Georgia that could affect how certification works. For instance, we had a decision Friday night in Arizona. The Secretary of State issues in that state what's called an election procedures manual that lays out the rules for things. He had laid out some certification rules saying basically if local officials in a county refuse to certify, he would be permitted to go ahead and certify the state totals without including the votes from that late county. A court said, no, actually, you can't do that. That would be disenfranchising all of the voters from that county because of the actions of these local officials. And you have these other remedies available to you. You can go to court and force them to do it. You don't need to do that. That's not in state law anywhere. We're enjoining you from doing that. You have to include the votes of all the counties if you certify. So that's a change in the law. The state may or may not appeal. That's not clear yet. But in some states, these rules are still evolving. There are still court challenges that could affect them. And I just wanted to remind everyone to pay attention to that. Thanks for giving me a minute.
I'm also happy to jump in on that unless you want to move on to the next question. So I think the answer sort of depends on state law, what state law says, and what state law says with respect to the role of county canvassers. To give you one example, in Georgia, Georgia law actually does give the county official some role in resolving numerical discrepancies in vote totals before certification. So they have that role, and it's specifically laid out in the statute. So they do have to follow that process. Now, if they engage in that process and they can't resolve the discrepancy by the certification deadline, it doesn't matter. They still have to certify. And here's what they have to do. They have to put on the record what the discrepancy was, what they did to try to resolve it, and then report up the results and certify it to the Secretary of State. Them certifying it does not mean that there's no problems. It just means that here's what we did within the state law parameters, within the deadline that was allotted to us. Here is the, we're going to certify the results so an election contest can be filed in court, so a court can resolve this issue, and we're going to transmit the election returns to the Secretary of State so he has them. And so just because there are issues, even significant issues, does not mean that they have sort of carte blanche to refuse certification. They still have to certify the results so an election contest and other proceedings can start.
Thank you. And I believe that statute even says that they have to sort of certify a just and accurate count or something like that. So to me, that really says do the best you can to represent all the eligible votes that should be counted, and then there may be court proceedings after if somebody has a problem with what result you've reached. So I think we're at the time where we're about to go over to audience questions. I'm really interested to hear what people have to ask. So I really encourage people to put those questions in the Q&A. And Emily, I believe you're going to hop on and join us and help us moderate those.
Hi everyone, thanks Gary. Yeah, we have a lot of interesting questions. I think maybe in the spirit of the discussion that you guys have just been having, I guess like we could ask a couple of questions and anybody who wants to chime in can do that. So the first question is, what are 2 or 3 databases or tools that you'd recommend for investigating elections? I know Justin, you spoke about the Insurrection Index, but is there anything that you use kind of on a weekly, daily basis that you'd recommend to investigative journalists who are looking into elections?
Yeah, I think all the things that I put in that chat, like Crew, American Oversight, Democracy Docket, Vote Beat, the places that cover this stuff on a daily basis are important because there's a lot of moving parts here. There's lawsuits being filed all the time. There's a lot of different issues that we have to consider when thinking about what's going to happen in November, which of course has nothing to do with the actual politics of this and who's going to win. But I think those are probably some of the best resources that people can tap into to stay on top of things and understand who all the players are and how all this works.
I'll just add that I spend a lot of time trying to figure out which voters are affected by something, and the most helpful tool for that is always a voter roll, right? Who's on the voter roll? Where do they live? And depending on your data proficiency and the amount of money you have, you can do various sophisticated things with that. There have been times in my career when I've had access to a sort of full commercial voter roll that's constantly updated by a commercial vendor. And you can map the precise address of every voter and the distance to the nearest polling place and things like that. There's also been times when, we've had to work with a voter roll from a single county because the cost of a voter roll differs depending on the jurisdiction. And we've had to clean it up ourselves. And it's sort of a static snapshot of what the voter roll looked like at the moment we obtained it. So depending on what you have access to, a voter roll can be really helpful depending on the kind of question you want to answer. Some states put out great statistics. North Carolina is one of them, about who's already requested an absentee ballot and who's registered to vote. Others don't put out such great data, so it depends on where you are, but I would look at what's available in the jurisdiction you're looking at. I would also note that even though it's messy, imperfect, and flawed, the US Election Assistance Commission does a survey every 2 years called the Eves survey, and it captures a lot of data about how elections are administered and conducted in different jurisdictions. Again, I have found problems with this data. It's not perfect, but it is the best available. And so if you're looking for questions about, for instance, I've written about the age of poll workers in different jurisdictions, right? If you want to know how many polling places there are, if you want to know a bunch of things about registered voters, it asks a lot of questions. That data is available on the USEAC site. And it can be helpful if you understand what you're looking at and you understand that it's sort of reported by the jurisdictions and may not be absolutely perfect.
I think Justin's got something to chime in with as well.
Real quick, yeah, I just wanted to point out, like, I am not an expert on, I didn't report on elections before 2020. So what got me into this was something that I think I need to mention, which is that, like, for anybody who wants to report on this stuff, start with where you're at or the localities. This is one idea. Start with where you're at or the localities that you're interested in. I got sucked into this because I started looking into county election boards in Georgia, and then it just snowballed from there. Because what I was hearing at these meetings, I was listening and watching and going to the county election board meetings. I mean, these are not people, frankly, a lot of times who have a very in-depth knowledge of how all of this stuff works either. You know what I mean? So I would say that anybody who's interested in getting into this, that a good way to do it is to start with your local election board, or if you're interested in Pennsylvania, find some county election board who have their meetings online. Watch them on YouTube, and you'll see, and you'll start to understand what it is that they're dealing with.
That's super helpful. I'm going to drop a link in the chat as well to a colleague of mine who put out a report. It can help with just kind of an overview of the like nitty-gritty steps, like who does this reconciling the voter check-in files with the ballot numbers and things like that. And it has helpfully some updates since 2022. So there are some states that have taken steps to speed up this process and help get to official results faster. And some states have unfortunately taken steps that are going to potentially slow it down. So it can be a helpful overview in terms of is this slow, like because the normal process is being followed, or is this slow because something is going wrong here? So that's a helpful resource as well. Emily, is there other questions we should get to?
Yeah, so I don't know who wants to start with this one, but Justin's story quotes leading election lawyer Mark Elliott stating that, "I think we're going to see mass refusals to certify the 2024 election. If that worst case prediction turns out to be accurate, what other story topics should reporters be prepared for?"
Well, I think so. Yeah, along the lines of some of what Carrie said earlier, I mean, I think one thing is important to point out here is that these votes to refuse to certify, I've started to think of them as essentially protest votes, right? And the reason that is because the people who are voting against certification are getting outvoted on their county election board or whatever the local government body is by other people on that board. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, and not that rule, but there are exceptions to that. And those are localities and counties where election deniers have a majority on that government body. And that list is sort of in formulation right now as to where all those places are. But to the answer of the question about what to look for next, in the event of mass certification refusals, Nikhil brought up a really good point, which is like reporters should be going to their secretaries of state and their governors, and they should be asking, if you have mass certification refusals, are you going to file writs of mandamus against county election officials and take them to court to force them to certify? To the governors, reporters should be asking, are you going to sign certificates of ascertainment? To states, members of Congress, reporters should be asking, are you going to accept certificates of ascertainment, even if there are claims of widespread voter fraud? And this is the most important thing to remember about the certification refusal movement. It is designed to sow distrust in elections. It is not necessarily a legal mechanism that can prevent the tallying or certification of votes. But what it's going to do is open a window for the election denial movement and Donald Trump and Republicans to say, look at all these refusals to certify, look at all these problems. And that's why Nikhil's point about asking government officials what they will do in those instances, that's an important next step for reporters to take.
Yeah, I like what you making that cosmic point, both of you, that this isn't necessarily designed to work, right? Like this is designed to create doubt. I think there's a practical point and a practical series of questions and facts that are also sometimes helpful to note and to ask. One is that where we have seen refusal to certify in most cases, not all, but in many cases, we have seen refusal to certify in mainly areas controlled by Republicans and dominated by Republican voters. Not entirely, right? Like this first cropped up in Wayne County in Michigan. I don't want to be too absolutist about it, but I will note that this is something like Cochise County in Arizona, right? Mojave County in Arizona, townships in Pennsylvania. They tend to be places that involve a lot of Republican votes. So it's also worth talking to the public officials who are refusing to certify and noting that they are, in fact, like, if the Republican Party is urging people not to certify, they are in many cases urging them not to certify Republican votes. They would be disenfranchising in many of these places large numbers of Republican voters. Mm-hmm. And so it's worth talking to them about why they think those results are, in fact, not accurate. And it's worth making the point about, again, as I always say, which voters would be affected by this, right? And so I think that there may be officials on any board, including in counties that lean Democratic, who are refusing to certify, right? Like there's someone in Fulton County who's filed a lawsuit about this. But in the end of the day, most of the time, places where Republicans have a majority on local boards are often places where there are many Republicans. So, it's worth talking to the local Republican Party officials who are urging those people not to certify and saying, like, why do you think there's so much fraud in Republican areas? Like, what are we talking about here? Your guy won, right? Like, what do you think happened here? And so in some cases, they will say, well, actually, we think the problem is in this very Democratic city over here. But we're urging people not to certify as a protest. And then you have to say, like, how do you feel about disenfranchising all of these voters? But I think it's worth looking at who's affected by this stuff, and it's worth keeping that in mind.
Yeah, so I just to jump in here, totally agree with the high risk of disenfranchising Republican voters, and we've already seen that happen in a few counties in 2022, or at least a risk of disenfranchising voters. I would also say that like the protest votes where they know they're not going to be able to actually stop certification, and the other votes where they may be able to stop certification, but they're protesting votes in other counties. I think it's important for reporters to understand that it may not just be about delaying certification at the county level or even the state level. They may simply be laying the groundwork to try and dispute the results on January 6, 2025. based on, alleged massive fraud in, say, Fulton County, Georgia. And we know that that is a likely strategy because that's what they did last time. So we don't have to sort of guess about what they're going to do because they did it before. And it's something we should be keenly aware of to the extent that there are through lines between 2020 and this election.
Thank you. So this is a bit of an open-ended question. Obviously you kind of talked about US actors that are involved in influencing elections, but have any of you looked into international actors that might try to influence it, and what recommendations would you give to track them if so?
Speak a
I
little bit. Oh, Justin, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have not. I think, boy, that is such a great question, because I feel like with all of this stuff that there has been to focus on for US based reporters, the certification refusal stuff, just the daily deluge of sort of election interference and subversion stuff from Republicans. One thing that has probably gotten lost in all of this is the ongoing misinformation campaigns by bad actors in Russia or Iran, or I mean, like, do I think that 8 years on from 2016 that those things are just like not happening anymore? I mean, I think that it's and I think the Tenet media story from a few weeks back shows that malicious foreign actors haven't expressed interest in sowing distrust and urging chaos in U.S. election systems and just in our normal sort of day-to-day democratic process. So I think that is a massive story that is still waiting to be dug into and exposed a little bit, because I think all of those people, and perhaps more in perhaps places like China, I'm sure that all of that misinformation is going on, and I just haven't really seen that much in the way of people looking into it.
Now, one thing I'll say on that is that we do have reports from a number of US intelligence agencies and some big corporations like Microsoft that track some of this activity. And they have all repeatedly said throughout this election cycle that there are entities affiliated with and backed by non-US governments that are trying to sow confusion, sow doubt, sow discord, spread false information around the US elections. So I wouldn't be surprised, just like a few years after the 2016 election, we really saw the full sort of gamut of this type of thing that was done by agents affiliated with the Russian government. I wouldn't be surprised if we, go back and find that there was some nudging going on, really probably unknown to the people who were targeted by it, when it comes to things like certification, because as all our panelists have said, that the goal does really seem to be to sow doubt and confusion as opposed to actually succeed in stopping the certification. I want to thank everyone for coming. We have gotten to the end of our time, but I want to make sure we thank Global Investigative Reporting Network and our audience today. And of course, a really huge thank you to the speakers, Justin, Carrie, and Nikhil. And I also wanted to put in a plug here for GIGN's Twitter feed. It's at GIJN. And their website as well. You can get details on future events there. And we really appreciate everyone's participation.